That's correct.
All right. Now, when you annexed that document to the affidavit of the 6th of April 2021, did you amend that document in any way?
Not at that annex. Not at that time.
At that time, no. So that you hadn't updated it in any way when you annexed it to the first affidavit?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the second affidavit, so the affidavit dated the 3rd of October 2022, there is an annexure HG5 which contains an updated timeline.
That's correct.
Now, is the timeline as follows? Sometime before October 2022, you were asked to provide a supplementary affidavit.
That's correct.
And you've been informed that the coroner was investigating the death of Kumanjayi Walker.
That's correct.
And as a part of that investigation, she was investigating decision-making surrounding the withdrawal of health staff from Yindimur.
That's correct.
All right. And you understood that it was important to provide as much information as you could.
That's correct.
In part because there might be criticisms that there had been deficiencies in health decision-making.
That's correct.
You were aware at the time you updated that timeline that a root cause analysis had been conducted by the Department of Health, is that correct?
I'm not sure if it was completed at the time that I updated my timeline, but I was aware that it was being undertaken, yes.
So you were certainly aware that it was being done?
That's correct.
All right. If I put it to you that the root cause analysis was completed on the 31st of August, or at least that it was circulated to counsel assisting on the 31st of August, and you furnished your second affidavit on the 22nd of October, would it stand to reason that you updated the timeline after that root cause analysis was complete?
It may have been. I had not received that root cause analysis findings, though.
Okay. Now, I take it that you updated the chronology that you'd prepared on the 10th of November 2019.
That's correct.
And then annexed it to the affidavit of October 2022.
That's correct.
Did you rely on any other contemporaneous notes when updating that timeline?
No.
Okay. So the updates are reflected in blue text.
That's
in that
correct.
Updated timeline. Those updates are entirely reliant on your memory of events, is that correct?
That's correct.
Your memory of events some 3 years later.
That's correct.
Had you been involved in discussions with the Department of Health? Perhaps you hadn't been given the findings, but involved in discussions around the root cause analysis?
I was interviewed.
And had you discussed the decision-making on the 9th of November with other health staff in the 3 years in between the 9th of November and the 22nd of October 2022?
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
Okay. The first date is the 9th of November 2019.
That's correct.
The second date is the 22nd of October 2022.
Mm-hmm.
In the interim, have you had discussions with other health staff about the decision-making that had been undertaken in November 2019?
Obviously with the root cause analysis, also within our primary and public healthcare services for what we could improve on and lessons learnt from the withdrawal of our staff that weekend.
And those discussions would have included people like David Reeve,
That's correct.
Naomi Heinrich.
Not that I spoke to Naomi, no.
Okay. What about clinic staff from Yindimur who'd been in Yindimur in November 2019?
I don't have any recollection.
Okay. Certainly you were aware that there'd been a good deal of media attention and the like around both the trial and the Coronial inquest?
That's correct.
And you knew that it was a matter of some significance for the Department of Health?
Absolutely.
All right. Can I just ask you two questions then about the chronology, what it is, and I suppose how sure you are of its contents?
Yes.
The first question I have for you is, would you say you're pretty confident that the things that you did write in November 2019 are accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Because they're contemporaneous?
I'm not sure of that word, but yes.
You made them at the time.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
But the mere fact that you had to update the timeline in October 2022 suggests that there were things that you didn't put in those notes.
That's correct.
Okay. So you'd accept that there were omissions from those original notes?
Yes.
Given how much later you made the updated timeline, would you accept that there could be other things not included in the blue text that you might have omitted from that timeline?
Yes.
Okay. The second question I wanted to ask you concerns the blue editions themselves. You made them some 3 years after the events.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you were doing your best to recall not just one conversation you'd had on the 9th of November, but perhaps a series of about 50 conversations.
That's correct.
Over 2 days.
That's correct.
And in that blue text, you provide what I might suggest to you is an extraordinary level of detail for someone recalling events 3 years after the fact.
It was a significant event.
But you would agree that there is an extraordinary level of detail.
Yes, I would agree.
And I think you've already agreed that the matter had been widely reported in the media in the intervening period.
That's correct.
And you had discussions about it with the Department of Health, staff within the Department of Health.
That's correct.
Do you accept when you were updating that timeline some 3 years later, there is a risk that you may have misremembered some of the text in blue?
There's an obvious risk.
That risk is compounded to some extent by the fact that you were also receiving information about the events of the 9th of November from sources external to yourself.
I accept that.
Can I move away from the documents themselves and just ask you some introductory questions about who you are and what you do?
Excuse
You're
me.
originally from New Zealand, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And can I ask you first, let's forget your kind of management background.
Mm-hmm.
What's your clinical background?
Yep, so I'm a registered nurse. I have been practicing within Australia since 2004 this time. Prior to that, it has been, my nursing background's been in New Zealand from 1995 when I registered. Combination of emergency department, mental health units, and high dependency intensive care units, and education as well. And since arriving in Australia this time, predominantly I worked at...
Was you there?
Yes.
You say this time, was this around 2004?
2004 and 1999 I came over and worked at Cabrini cardiothoracic unit in Melbourne.
That's in the southeastern suburbs somewhere.
Yeah.
But perhaps let's focus on 2004, which is when I gather you came to the Territory for the first time.
That's correct.
Can I ask you why you've decided to come to the Territory?
I was looking for something different. I never believed that nursing is something that is completed within four walls. I was looking for an opportunity to do more, I guess, in a remote rural region, and to hopefully provide education and healthcare that wasn't necessarily restricted to within a structure as such.
What opportunities did you understand the Territory to offer in that?
Yeah, sure. So Indigenous health, the challenges within healthcare provision in remote locations. I had a previous colleague that had worked also in the Territory who was very positive in the opportunities of, seeing the location, and the opportunity arose, and so I came over.
Can you tell us a little bit about your practice, your clinical practice since 2004? I know that you've moved towards management.
Yep.
What was the nature of your clinical practice from 2004?
Yep, sure. So initially when I arrived, I worked in the emergency department here at Alice Springs Hospital. Then I transferred over to remote, which is now known as primary and public healthcare. I initially, when I commenced work with them, I was a relieving remote area nurse. So where there was staff on leave or we didn't have people filling positions, I would relocate around those communities. I then...
Can I just pause you there?
Yes.
Some of those communities were Walprig communities.
That's correct.
Including Yundamu.
That's correct.
You spent a bit of time in Kumanjayi.
That's correct.
Go on.
And then I was health centre manager out at Wataka Health Centre, which is also known as Kings Canyon. I was there for a couple of years, and then I had a break from primary and public healthcare and went and worked as an occupational health nurse on the Granite's gold mine out on the Tanamai. And then returned to primary and public healthcare in 2010, where I once again relieved in multiple communities and then was based in Tea Tree as the health centre manager. So over those periods of years, I've been a combination of a remote area nurse as well as the remote area nurse / health centre manager in those communities.
Now, ultimately, you've I know that you still do some clinical work.
That's correct.
You've taken on managerial responsibilities, is that right?
That's correct.
What's your current role within the Department of Health?
Currently, I'm the quality and safety manager for primary and public healthcare.
I want to ask you some questions about primary and public healthcare. I think Dr. Reeve gave us a bit of a potted definition of the difference between primary and secondary and tertiary healthcare, so you can assume a degree of familiarity with that term. But is it fair to say, in your view, that, and maybe this is one of the things that interests you in Indigenous health, but there is a real disparity in outcomes from a primary health perspective between urban centres and remote Indigenous communities?
I'd agree with that.
And that reflects rates of ill health in many remote Indigenous communities.
That's correct.
For example, remote Indigenous communities like Yundamu have some of the highest rates of chronic disease in Australia.
I accept that.
Things like rheumatic heart disease.
I accept, sorry.
Just got to verbalise for the record.
Sorry, yes, I accept that.
Other cardiac conditions.
I accept that.
Diabetes.
I accept that.
Other renal or kidney disease.
I accept that.
Respiratory illness.
I accept that.
But also acute mental health presentations.
That's correct.
For example, it's in remote Indigenous communities in the territory that we're seeing some of the highest suicide rates in the world amongst young adults.
That's correct.
And in relative terms, high rates of presentation with things like drug-induced psychoses.
That's correct.
So primary healthcare isn't just about ensuring that we deal with minor conditions in a long-term sense. It's also about dealing with what can be very acute presentations.
That's correct.
Things that require emergent or urgent responses.
That's correct.
Asthma attacks.
I accept that.
Anaphylaxis.
That's correct.
Heart attack.
That's correct.
Serious injury during fights.
Yes.
Lacerations, stabbings, gunshot wounds and the like.
I accept that.
And equally, people tragically who do things like try to take their lives.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, some of those acute presentations are beyond the skill set of a remote clinic to deal with.
I accept that.
But some of them can be dealt with, is that right?
That's correct.
So things like anaphylaxis, for example, could be dealt with an EpiPen.
That's correct.
All right. You said a moment ago that your role was, I think, quality and safety assurance, is that right?
Quality and safety manager, that's correct.
Is it fair to say that in order to assure the quality of the health services that the department's providing, you keep statistics?
That's correct.
And you keep those statistics to identify health needs across the territory?
That's correct.
Including by region?
That's correct.
And in part that's also to identify service gaps that might be arising?
That's correct.
To allocate resources?
That's correct.
And it's also just important to assure that you maintain the consistency and quality of the health services that you're providing, for example, to a community like Yuendumu.
That's correct.
Does the Department of Health keep performance indicators
We
for
do.
individual clinics?
That's correct.
So these would be stats that would enable you to monitor how one clinic in one location is performing as against another clinic?
That's correct.
Would there be stats that would enable you to monitor rates of compliance with regular echo screening of patients with rheumatic heart disease?
That's not part of our one of our key performance indicators.
Would there be other statistics that you keep that would allow you to monitor it on a clinic by clinic basis, or no?
Not off the top of my head.
What about statistics that would allow you to monitor rates of chronic disease screening?
Yes.
Rates of staff turnover?
Yes. It's not a key performance indicator, but yes.
But the statistic, the data
We would
be
have
there.
it.
Yeah.
Yes.
What about data that would allow you to monitor or measure the number of referrals from an individual clinic to a visiting general physician per capita?
That's not one of our key performance indicators that
Would
we
there be just the raw statistical data to allow you to measure it?
we would be able to obtain that.
Are there other important metrics or measures or KPIs that you use to measure the performance of one clinic as against another?
No, just our normal NT KPIs.
Are those KPIs publicly available somewhere?
I believe so.
Could you list the KPIs for the role? I don't know how lengthy they are, if there are 100 or so of them perhaps.
Standing up.
Sorry, Council. They are lengthy, Your Honour, and they're a Northern Territory-wide KPI that's set with the Commonwealth Government, AMSANT and other parties. We can certainly provide those.
I won't ask you to specify
Sorry,
what they are.
there are a number of them.
Can I just ask you this though, as a part of quality assurance, would you also be monitoring complaints that are made about individual clinics?
That's correct.
All right. From 2019, are you aware, are you aware of any particular complaints about the Yuendumu Health Clinic, about the treatment or insensitivity towards Walker people in Yuendumu?
Not that I can recollect.
Do you know how residents would make a complaint?
There's a number of ways. So there is through the health centre itself, through the health advisory group. There is, we have a consumer engagement survey that is completed within the all of the communities by our local Aboriginal employment officers within Alice Springs here that travel out to communities. That's given options, and part of that survey is about the satisfaction that they are receiving. Do they feel that they're being heard? So we get feedback that way.
Just,
It's next to the
100. Sorry, go on.
And also we have the Northern Territory consumer feedback form that they can submit. They can also call the Health Commission, and there's other avenues that way.
This might be something you're able to answer on your feet, equally it might not, but do you have a sense of how Yuendumu Health Clinic is comparing to other health clinics in the Northern Territory on those KPIs?
Not without reviewing them. No, I'm sorry, I don't.
But that's something that could be done.
Absolutely, yep.
I want to ask you some questions now about temporary withdrawal of service.
Yes.
Now, I asked you some questions about how critical primary health care was, particularly in remote communities, but you'd agree, wouldn't you, that it's as a result of the significance of primary health care that temporary withdrawal of service is such a serious decision?
That's correct.
It can have real health implications for a population, is that right?
That's correct.
And those health implications can include avoidable hospitalisations
That's correct.
and preventable deaths.
That's correct.
And that's why I take it that the decision needs to be made at a relatively high managerial level,
That's correct.
the executive level.
That's correct.
When making decisions about temporary withdrawal, you need to make a risk assessment. Do you agree?
I agree.
Now, you're effectively balancing a number of things when you do this.
That's correct.
One of those things is level of risk to staff.
That's correct.
And on the other hand, you're balancing level of risk to community,
That's correct.
to health implications.
That's correct.
Now, do you accept that these are balanced in the sense that the higher the degree of risk to the community, the greater the degree of risk to your health staff needs to be before you could decide to pull them out of a community?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I might give you a more practical example.
Yep.
If a community was very, very healthy, it might be easier to justify the decision to withdraw staff on the basis of their safety than if a community was very, very unwell. Would you agree?
I would agree, but yes, I would agree.
Am I also right that these risks, or the level of risk on either side of the ledger, it isn't static, it can change over time?
Very much so.
And so when assessing risk and balancing risk, you need to reassess things if the data change.
That's correct.
Okay. Finally, and as the temporary withdrawal of service guidelines states, risk assessments need to be documented.
That's correct.
And you'd be well aware that that was one of the deficiencies identified in this case.
Yes.
And there are perhaps two reasons that these decisions need to be documented. If I could put the first to you, it's that it ensures accountability in the historical record.
That's correct.
But equally, and I think this is a word that Mr. Mullins used yesterday, it ensures that processes are followed.
I accept that.
Where there are checklists, it ensures that you check each box.
I accept that.
For example, you ensure that people who need to be notified of decision making are notified of decision making.
That's correct.
Can I ask you questions now about that first side of the ledger, which is your assessment of the degree of risk to staff? You say in your second affidavit that a significant consideration is the views of the staff members themselves.
That's correct.
And your evidence is that you need to take these views seriously,
That's correct.
even though they might be what we call subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because staff wellbeing is important,
That's correct.
but also because they're on the ground, correct?
That's correct.
They know the context.
That's correct.
You don't know as much as of the context.
That's correct.
You've also given evidence that staff have a tendency to underreport safety concerns.
In my affidavit, I have, yes.
But what follows from that, in your opinion, it seems, is that when staff come to you and say, we're worried about this, you've really got to listen.
That's correct.
Because a lot of the time they might be worried but say nothing.
That's correct.
So the mere fact that they're saying something is an indication in itself of the seriousness of the problem.
That's correct.
All right. You then say that you need to balance the subjective assessment against an objective consideration of the relevant circumstances.
That's correct.
Now, some of those circumstances, some of the information is information given to you by staff, would you agree?
I would agree.
But an important part of making an objective assessment is seeking out other information, would you agree?
That's correct.
And in the remote community context, that can mean liaising with other stakeholders.
That's correct.
A very significant stakeholder when the issue is staff safety is the police.
That's correct.
They are often best placed to provide information about levels of crime in a particular community.
That's correct.
In this case, it was suggested to you by Cass Holland, I think, that there was an influx of gunmen into the community.
That's correct.
And police would be best placed to tell you something about that, you might think.
That's correct.
But in addition to telling you something about crime, they can provide you critical information about things that they can do to mitigate risk.
That's correct.
They might have arrested an offender who was responsible for the break-ins, correct?
Correct.
They might be planning to conduct high visibility patrols on the streets of Yuendamu, for example.
That's correct.
They might have planned a community meeting to address increasing rates of crime.
Yes, that's correct.
You'd agree that all of those things are potentially protective in the sense that they might reduce risk,
That's correct.
and so it's essential that you know what they're doing before a decision about withdrawing is made. Would you agree?
I agree.
Okay. Another stakeholder, and one I think that you note in at least your second affidavit, is are elders within community.
That's correct.
And I'm using the word elders as a little bit of a loose catch-all for, senior Aboriginal people.
Yes.
And that's important first, just because it's their community.
That's correct.
You're providing the service to them,
Mm-hmm.
so it's respectful.
I accept that.
But also because they can be a really important source of information about what's happening in community. Would you agree?
I agree.
You might find out, for example, that there's a big funeral on.
I agree.
You might find out that family from one camp are fighting with another camp. Would you agree?
I agree.
You might find out that a kid who is responsible for some break-ins has been taken by family to Papunya.
I would agree.
So the things that you learn from elders are also potentially very significant to the risk assessment. Would you agree?
I agree.
I want to ask you some questions now about the 9th of November 2019. I'm going to skip through some of the chronology quickly. We have your affidavits, which are obviously very detailed, and they're a part of the evidence. So I'll focus on a couple of individual steps in the decision making. 9 o'clock, you received the first notification from Janine Bridge, is that right?
That's correct.
You're very welcome to go to
Timeline.
first or second chronology, up to you.
Yep.
In any event, she's received a call from Cass Holland, and Cass Holland had told her about the break-in at Vanessa Watts's house,
That's correct.
and Cass Holland effectively asked about covering for Watts because Watts was so fatigued.
That's correct.
All right. Now, at 9:08, you then notified David Reeve, correct?
That's correct.
Now, your next call was at about 9:12, so your conversation with Reeve could only have been 3 or 4 minutes long.
That's correct.
And as I understand it, you were just information sharing at that stage.
That's correct.
At 9:12, you then have a conversation with Cass Holland,
That's correct.
and she then relays to you some information about what's going on.
That's correct.
She says that staff are feeling unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
I want to suggest to you that she doesn't say that staff want to be removed. She
That's
just says,
correct.
That's correct.
That's correct.
She's just raising a concern about safety,
That's correct.
and she's looking for support.
That's correct.
Ms. Gill, did you tell her at that time that the way the department would support health staff in Yuendamu was by removing them from Yuendamu?
That's incorrect.
Okay. At 9:20, you then had a conversation with Fiona Cameron,
That's correct.
and you provided her with an update
That's correct.
based on what you'd been told by Janine Bridge
That's correct.
and Cass Holland.
That's correct.
You told her that the nurses weren't feeling safe.
No, that's not correct.
You didn't tell her that.
Not at that stage.
Okay. Did you have any discussions about the withdrawal of nurses from Yuendamu?
I had the discussion at that stage with Fiona Cameron regarding Vanessa Watts, that there had been, as discussed with Cassie Holland and documented in my timeline, if there was any other secured accommodation that Vanessa could have been moved into if there was damage or we were unable to secure her accommodation. If there was anywhere else within Yuendamu that we could securely accommodate her, and if there wasn't, because she kept referring to her as feeling spooked then we would possibly withdraw her to Alice Springs.
Okay. So insofar as there was discussion about withdrawal, your evidence is that it was limited to Vanessa Watts.
That's correct.
All right. Are you sure that you couldn't have discussed the possibility of withdrawing the entirety of the health clinic at that time?
That's correct.
You're sure?
I did not discuss that at that stage.
All right. At 9:30, so this is about 10 minutes after your conversation with Cameron started, you then had a second conversation with Cass Holland, do you agree?
That's correct.
Now, your notes say that you just asked Cass Holland for Luana Simon's number.
That's correct.
Is it possible that during the course of that conversation you said to Cass Holland, look, if clinic staff are unsafe, we're going to pull you out?
No,
It's not possible.
that's not the discussion that we had.
Okay. Would you accept, given what you've said about the possibility that there might be omissions from these notes, would you accept that it's possible that a conversation of that kind occurred?
It's possible, but that's not my recollection of that telephone call.
Indeed, it's possible that something of that kind was said in either of the conversation at 9:12 with Cass Holland or the conversation at 9:30, isn't it?
It's possible, but that's not my recollection.
I want to take you to some evidence, in fairness to you, some of the other evidence in the case. The first evidence I'll take you to is the evidence of Ms Holland herself. Your Honour, for the record, this is Ms Holland's slightly informal statement at 9-6 of the brief at page 1. Now, you don't have a copy of this, so if I'm reading too quickly, you let me know.
Okay.
But in effect, and this is the middle of the page, Ms Holland says, I made the phone call to the manager on call and described the previous night's events. Now, the manager on call at that time was Janine Bridges.
That's correct.
I explained that those concerned did not want Luana informed, as she was already stressed.
That's correct.
Luana was in Alice Springs.
That's correct.
Janine advised that she would need to notify the executive on call, Helen Gill.
That's correct.
The next paragraph reads, Helen rang me back after she'd escalated the information to Fiona Cameron. Helen advised that Luana would be told. Helen then requested that I visit the group of nurses personally to deliver the message that if they felt unsafe, they would be accommodated in Alice.
That's not my recollection.
No. Does it cause you to doubt your recollection at all, noting what you've said about your notes, that Ms Holland's recollection appears to be that you told her that at around about 9:30?
I feel that that's difficult because this is my recollection and that is Cassie's recollection, and so we have to respect both of them.
Now, Ms Holland goes on to say that she was then accompanied by John Alting to go on and visit some of the elders and speak to them about what was to occur in community. I'm not asking you to comment on that, I'm just providing you that information by way of context. The next piece of evidence that I want to take you to is the evidence of Janine Walker. Now, she gave a statutory declaration to the coroner on the 26th of June 2020, and she was one of the nursing staff on the ground in Yuendamu that day.
That's correct.
Okay. You may or may not be aware that she annexed to her statutory declaration a set of handwritten notes and gave evidence in the stat dec that she'd written those notes on the 12th of November 2019. So that's some 3 days after the events. Just want to read to you what she says happened. She says, the next morning, so this is the morning after the break-ins, the morning of the 9th, I was sitting outside when Cassandra Holland and John Alting pulled up in the clinic ambulance. I went over to talk with them. Cassandra informed me that she'd taken this matter higher up to the managers, Helen Gill, who wanted to evacuate us for our safety. Now, you'd agree that it sounds very much like Cass Holland was telling her, Helen Gill has told us that if we're feeling unsafe, we're out.
That's implied in what you've read, yes.
And that evidence, which was as good as Ms. Walker's memory 3 days after the events, appears to be consistent with Ms. Holland's memory of her conversation with you. You'd agree?
That appears that way.
And perhaps I can just take you to Ms. Cameron's evidence, or some of Ms. Cameron's evidence. I won't go there. Ms. Gill, I'm not suggesting that you had made a final decision at 9:30 in the morning, but could I suggest to you that it's possible that you had said to the nursing staff, look, if you guys are feeling unsafe, what's on the table is withdrawal?
My recollection of my telephone call at that time that you've brought me to thus far is with Cassie Holland, and that the discussion was, excuse me, in regards to the security of Vanessa Watts's house. It was in regards to if there was no other way to provide her safe and secure accommodation, and that she requested to be, or would like to be, we could withdraw Vanessa and bring her into town for the weekend. At that stage, the discussion was only regarding Vanessa, but that we needed to ask how the other staff were feeling.
Given that you contemplated at that time, so that's at 9:30 or thereabouts in the morning on the 9th of November, that you would ask staff how they were feeling.
Yep.
Could it have been suggested that if they were feeling bad and unsafe, the option would have been to withdraw them as well, like Ms. Watts?
It's a possibility.
Okay. I mean, that would make sense given that what you contemplated for Ms. Watts was withdrawal, correct?
That's correct.
And so if other staff members felt unsafe, it's likely that what you would have contemplated doing for them would have been withdrawing them as well.
It was a possibility, yes.
Okay. I want to ask you some questions just quickly about the conversation you had with Luana Simmons at 11:15am.
Yes,
Now, Luana was in Alice Springs, correct?
that's correct.
Now, she said to you that all staff are requesting to withdraw. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Did you ask her which staff?
No, I did not.
Did you think it was important that you speak to the staff who wanted to leave at that time?
Yes,
And you did that at 11:40.
that's correct.
Okay. I want to be careful about the timeline here, though. At 11:15am, you had not yet spoken with any member of the police force.
That's correct.
You hadn't spoken to any of the Indigenous staff.
That's correct.
You hadn't spoken to any of the elders,
That's correct.
any of the other stakeholders.
That's correct.
And indeed, the only staff on the ground in Yuendamu you had spoken directly to was Cass Holland, correct?
At that stage, that's correct.
All right. You hadn't even spoken with Vanessa Watts.
That's correct.
All right. Or any of the other nurses whose houses had been broken into.
That's correct.
All right. At 11:35am, you then got on the phone to Fiona Cameron, correct?
Mhm. That's correct.
And your second affidavit, page 32, you say, well, I notified her of the request of Yuendamu Clinic staff to all be removed from community.
That's correct.
All right. And Fiona Cameron said that she'd notify Reeve.
That's
David Reeve.
correct.
Now, you then had a telephone call at 11:40, correct?
That's correct.
That was the conference call with all of the staff.
That's correct.
And your next call was at 11:50 when Fiona contacted you and said, David has made the decision. You're approved for withdrawal.
That's correct.
All right. So the information on which David Reeve approved the withdrawal was the information you provided to Fiona Cameron at 11:35am.
I believe that, as you have noted, that by omission, I believe that I have misdocumented there, where I have contacted Fiona after the telephone call.
You think
It is not documented in my timeline, though.
Okay. Now, the times in the timeline you extracted, or at least your evidence is that you extracted those times from your phone, correct?
That's correct, in my notes.
And You're assuming some 3 years later that there must have been an error in this timeline.
That's correct.
Would you agree that the best evidence of the timeline is the timeline
That's correct.
that you made as the events were occurring?
That's correct.
Would you agree that it's probable that you called Fiona at 11:35 and then called the clinic staff at 11:40?
That's correct.
It's probable then, isn't it, that the information that was relayed to David Cameron is the information you provided Fiona at 11:35, correct?
That's possible, yes.
Okay. And that was information that didn't take into account the views of the various stakeholders I've just taken you to.
That's correct.
All right. You'd agree that David Reeves' risk assessment was as good as the information he had, correct?
That's correct.
You've also agreed that information from stakeholders like police, elders, education, the views of staff members are critical to making an accurate risk assessment.
That's correct.
But he didn't have any of that information, did he?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And any information that had been relayed to David Reeve was information that was almost a fourth-hand account of what the nurses wanted. Would you agree?
I agree.
Perhaps I'll disaggregate that for you. A nurse had spoken to Luana Simons about the views of the entire clinic. Is that right?
I believe so.
Luana Simons had relayed that information to you.
That's correct.
You relayed that information to Fiona Cameron.
That's correct.
And Fiona Cameron relayed that information to David Reeve.
Yeah, that's correct.
I want to ask you some questions now about your 11:40am conference. Now, at that conference, at least all of the non-Indigenous staff who were present in Yuendamu gathered. I forget which house it was. Can you remember?
At Janine's, I believe.
And you'd agree that all of the non-Indigenous staff were gathered together so that you could have a conversation with them.
That's correct.
And staff were telling you things about what was happening.
That's correct.
And they were telling you things about what they wanted you to do.
That's correct.
At paragraph 76 of your first or second affidavit, perhaps I'll put it to you, and if you agree, you agree. If you don't, we can go to the documents. But would you agree that this is when you first found out about the additional break-ins?
I'd agree with that.
Okay.
Yes.
And given the evidence you've given about the probable timeline, this isn't information that David Reeve is likely to have had when he made his decision at around about 11:40 or 11:50, correct?
Your Honour, and Mr. Reeve has put on himself put on evidence as to the information that was before him at the time that he made the decision.
And that evidence might be accepted, and equally it might not.
Well, is that a fair proposition for this witness?
It's a matter for submissions, Your Honour. I'm happy to move on. All right. Your account of that meeting is that staff were asking to leave. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I want to be careful here. Were staff saying we're unsafe and we want support, or were they saying we're unsafe and we want to go?
So the initial conversation was, the initial part of the conversation, all staff, there was one spokesperson at that stage, and that was Janine, and the statement from her was that all staff had chosen to request to be withdrawn. They did not feel safe in the community.
Okay. So you understood it to be the view of all staff members that they wanted to go?
All non-Indigenous staff members present at that meeting, that's correct.
Were you aware that Matilda Starbuck, one of the most junior nurses in this cohort, has given evidence that though she felt unsafe, she wasn't necessarily saying, we're asking you to withdraw us. Were you aware of that?
No.
Were you aware that Ms Starbuck's evidence appears to be that they wanted support and they feel like management then made the decision to withdraw them but didn't offer them an alternative?
No, I didn't know that.
Were you aware that her evidence was that when the community was ultimately told that the staff wanted to leave, that she felt like she'd been made a scapegoat.
No, I did not.
Equally, Ms Holland's evidence was that she did not want to leave.
That's correct.
Is your recollection that she expressed that view to you during the meeting?
So near the end of the meeting, Ms Holland actually made the statement that she wanted to stay in community, that she termed it locked in, that she wouldn't go outside of her house so that community were unaware that she was there. We talked that through, and I made the decision that that was not an option to stay in community on her own due to safety concerns, and also with our RAN staff safety policies and guidelines. We don't have one staff member within communities. It's unsafe to attend. It's against our safety guidelines.
Equally, John Alting, one reading of his evidence, it's not for you to say what his evidence is, Her Honour will decide that, but one reading of his evidence is that he suggested that something like a community meeting might be held. Do you have any recollection of that?
That was not discussed with me, no.
Okay. But that in the end, management in town, said no.
That's his evidence.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of that being the dynamic in that conversation, that members of the clinic staff on the ground were saying, look, we want support, but the support doesn't necessarily need to be withdrawal?
That was not the conversation that I recollect.
In the root cause analysis, it's suggested that options to keep health workers in Yuendamu were considered but not pursued by primary healthcare management because they did not sufficiently mitigate the risks posed to the identified safety concerns. Are you aware that that's one of the findings of the root cause analysis?
I haven't thoroughly read through the root cause
But
analysis.
certainly you are, or you were in that context, PHC management.
I
is that
was.
correct?
I accept that.
What options did you consider?
So the consideration was obviously initially when the conversations commenced was about if there were other secure accommodation for those that required or where we were unable to provide secure accommodation to them within community. Obviously, the other things that we considered was what other support we could provide via Yulumu to health staff.
Can I just clarify there, when you say what other support you could provide via Yulumu, is that the notion of the Yulumu nurses covering the clinical needs of Yuendamu, or were they going to support the nurses in Yuendamu in some other way?
It was certainly, if we were required at that stage to withdraw staff, where one of the things that you take into consideration is that if that is the event that happens, then how will we provide emergency provision to that community? And
So I want to leave that part of the risk assessment to one side. What I'm really asking about you about at the moment is whether you considered alternative ways of reducing the risk to the safety of Yuendamu clinic staff to an acceptable level.
Yep. There was no.
So, for example, no consideration was given to the possibility of additional staff from Alice Springs coming into Yuendamu,
That's correct.
and no consideration was given to having a community meeting or something of the like.
That's correct.
All right. I want to ask you some questions about the presence or absence of Indigenous staff from this meeting at 11:40. Certainly they were not present at that meeting.
That's correct.
Were you aware of who the Indigenous staff were in Yuendamu at that time?
Yes, but I wasn't aware if they were in community on the day.
Okay. Did you ask anyone a question about that?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Did you ask anyone at the 11:40 meeting to go and fetch the Indigenous staff members?
I requested that they go and have the discussion. I didn't ask anyone to fetch anyone.
You requested that they have a discussion after the 11:40 meeting.
It was discussed at the 11:40 meeting that they have the discussion with the Indigenous health staff.
But I just want to clarify the purpose of the 11:40 meeting. And the purpose of the 11:40 meeting was, in effect, to get everyone together and to make a decision about what the clinic wanted to do.
That's correct.
Okay. And the clinic is made up of staff of more than one race.
That's correct.
And the only staff present at that meeting were members of the non-Indigenous race.
That's correct.
All right. Why didn't you say, okay, somebody go get Jabberson or Mary or Nola and get them here?
It's an oversight.
Okay. But didn't they need to feel a part of this decision making?
That's correct.
Didn't they need to feel like the decision hadn't been made in their absence and that they'd just been notified about it after the fact?
I accept that.
These Indigenous staff members were Aboriginal members of the community of Yuendamu.
That's correct.
And the decision you were making collectively, but in their absence, affected the community of which they were members.
I accept that.
But they were also professionals, weren't they?
That's correct.
And their input as professionals should be valued by the department. Do you agree?
I agree.
And you might think that they had important input as Indigenous professionals to provide to this decision-making process at 11:40. Would you agree?
I accept that.
All right. Do you think that it's, or would you agree that it's essential that if decisions are to be made about the working conditions of a mixed race workforce, that systems be in place to ensure that management does not just consider the views of one race when making a decision?
That's correct. I accept that.
Are you familiar with the concept of systemic racism?
No.
Would you agree that in addition to situations where people are deliberately or consciously racist, and I am not suggesting that this was one such occasion, but would you agree that there might be situations where institutions or systems fail to provide equal opportunities to people of different races?
I accept that there are some.
And one of those opportunities in the workforce is the opportunity to provide input when significant decisions are being made about you as an employee.
Sure.
And about your community.
I accept that.
Now, would you accept that, not by design, but in its outcome, the process for making that decision at 11:40 on November 2019 operated in a way that included all of the non-Indigenous staff, but did not include any of the Indigenous staff?
I accept that.
And do you agree that the outcome of that process was that the Indigenous staff members were discriminated against?
Not intentionally, no.
But
I
the
don't
outcome
accept
was-
that.
The outcome was that they did not enjoy the same opportunities of the non-Indigenous staff. Do you agree that?
I agree that they weren't included in there, but I don't agree that I was racist in that manner.
I'm not saying that you were racist, but the outcome of the decision is that only the members of one race didn't enjoy the opportunity
Your
of
Honour,
providing input.
I object, Your Honour. That's not the evidence. The evidence is that Luana Simons was involved in the telephone call. She is not of the same race as everyone else. Dr. Rosser is Indigenous. She was also on the telephone call. The propositions that are being expressed do not reflect the evidence.
I'll qualify it, Your Honour. Do you agree that no Indigenous member of the local Walpuri community was included in
I
that?
accept that.
I want to ask you some questions about the request that you made of your staff during the 11:40 meeting, that they meet with elders and traditional owners, police, teachers, and the Yuendamu Old Persons Program.
That's correct.
Now, can I just ask you to have a look at the second chronology, which is at page 32 of your second affidavit. Now, towards the bottom of the page, the second last bullet point reads, I requested that local community members be notified of the temporary reduction of the services and that all emergencies will be covered by Yuendamu Health Centre. In particular, I requested that staff speak with the elders and traditional owners, police, teachers, Yuendamu Old Persons Program. Do you agree?
I agree.
All right. The first thing I want to ask you about that is this. What you were asking them to do was notify them, correct?
That is the terminology I used.
Of a decision that had been made.
Of a potential decision to be made.
And certainly by the time you got off that call, the 11:40 call, you got a call at 11:50 and you were notified the decision had been made.
That's correct.
So unless they snuck out of the house and in the next 60 seconds or so consulted with the local elders, they were notifying them that a decision had been made. Would you agree?
I'd agree.
Okay. They weren't consulting with them.
I wasn't present during their conversations, but I would agree with you.
The second question I want to ask you about that is this. You'd agree that that line is in blue text,
That's correct.
and that means that it was not present in the first chronology,
That's correct.
and you would agree that it is not in your first affidavit.
I agree.
So I take it that this is one of those things that you inserted into the chronology some 3 years after events
I accept that.
without the assistance of notes.
I accept that.
Were you aware at the time you put together this affidavit in October of 2022 that questions of race and racism might arise in the inquest?
There was potential.
Is it possible that that records something that you think you might have done or that you wish you'd done but that you're not sure that you did do?
No.
It's not possible.
Oh, it is possible.
I want to ask you some questions now about the Yuendamu nurses and what was to happen with Yuendamu. Now, there's the 11:50 call with Cameron. She tells you the decision's been made, correct?
That's correct.
And then you have a 12:10 conversation with David Reeve, correct?
That's correct.
Now, in both conversations, you were told that management above you wanted 2 nurses to cover Yuendamu, correct?
Oh, that's correct.
All right. You then got on the phone with Janine Rawaka at 12:10 and you said, look, management want 2 staff to go to Yuendamu.
That's correct.
Okay. You'd agree that the next telephone call was at 12:36 p.m.
That's correct.
And during that call, you were notified by Janine Rawaka that no staff were willing to go to Yuendamu.
That's correct.
Right, I want to ask you about 3 things here. The first is, your evidence is that you were never made aware that John Alting was in fact willing to go to Yuendamu.
That's correct.
Okay. So the information that you were given was in fact incorrect.
I can only go on the information that I've been given.
But if we assume for the moment that John Alting did volunteer to go to Yuendamu,
Mm-hmm.
and if we assume that you weren't told that...
Oh, yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
It would stand to
Excuse
reason
me.
that the information you then relayed to Fiona Cameron was also incorrect.
That's correct.
So there was a communication breakdown here.
Possibly.
Possibly. Now, the second thing I want to ask you is about the timing. You'd asked Janine to discuss this option at 12:10,
That's correct.
and the notification you receive is at 12:36 p.m.
That's correct.
So 26 minutes had elapsed. You'd agree?
Yes.
At most, depending on how long your conversation with Janine was at 12:10.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that's a remarkably short amount of time to allow two individuals who might be feeling fearful to decide whether they were going to uplift their lives and move to a remote Indigenous community 2 hours down the road.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're referring to.
Effectively, what you were asking Janine to do is ask the other nurses, is anyone happy to go to Yullamoo?
That's correct.
That was a relatively big decision for them, wasn't it?
I would accept that.
And at most, there were 26 minutes within which all of the staff members could decide whether they were willing to make that decision.
I didn't put a time frame on the time that they gave
I'm not
their
suggesting
decision.
you did. I'm just asking about the time that actually elapsed.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I want to read to you from some of John Alting's evidence. This is at 9:1, Your Honour. His evidence is, another thing was that, who was it? Someone asked, would two of us go to Yullamoo to reinforce the staff there so that we could cover the clinic from Yullamoo? And I volunteered, but no one else did. But to be honest, I don't think there was not much time given to people to think about it, or not everyone, I think, was there. Would you accept that really more time should have been allowed to make this important decision about who was going to go to Yullamoo?
As I stated, there was no time frame put on from my request. The time frame that we can obviously see here is from the time frame from when I made the call to when I received the return call from Janine.
Certainly. But in that return phone call from Janine, did you say, okay, go get out there and have some more conversations, mull it over?
No, I didn't.
So you just accepted as conclusive what she told you at 12:36.
That's correct.
The third thing I want to ask you about is, it's this. Look, would you agree that ensuring that Yullamoo was adequately staffed was very important on the 9th of November?
That's correct.
It was a very important part of ensuring that the withdrawal was safe for the community of Yullamoo.
That's correct.
But it was also important to ensure that the withdrawal was safe for Yullamoo, wasn't it?
That's correct.
Because the Yullamoo clinic ended up servicing the needs of two communities.
That's correct.
Indeed, as we know, before Lorraine Walcott and Heather Zanker left Yullamoo, as one of them was preparing the ambulance, the other one was treating a sick child. Were you aware of that?
I was aware of that.
And so there was a real risk, wasn't there, that there'd be concurrent health needs
I accept that.
and the nurses could only be one place at one time.
I accept that.
Okay. We are also aware I'll leave that. To your knowledge, there'd been no recent reports of break-ins in Yullamoo?
To my knowledge.
Was there accommodation in Yullamoo that could have housed the Yullamoo nurses?
Yes, there was. There were two houses.
And this was an emergency, in a sense.
Yes.
Why didn't you direct two of the nurses to go to Yullamoo?
The information I had received was that all staff stated that they felt unsafe. That was a reasonable priority for myself to ensure that they remained or were made to feel safe. And so giving staff to state that they feel unsafe are obviously traumatised in some way, on some level. So by giving them a directive that says you have to an already traumatised person, I'm sorry, but that was not a thought process of mine to give the directive.
Okay. I want to pick that apart a little bit. The
Sure.
Trauma, if it be trauma, arose in a particular context. Do you agree?
I agree.
And that context was a series of break-ins from the 6th of November to the 9th of November in Yuendamu.
That's correct.
And removing them from Yuendamu, in a very significant sense, remove them from the context, correct?
That's correct.
Did you have any discussions with staff about whether they would have felt safe in Yuendamu?
No, that was I didn't have those discussions. I requested, as per what I was asked to request, was if 2 staff would go to Yuendamu.
Is your evidence that Janine actually told you why the staff didn't want to go to
No.
Yuendamu? Indeed, in paragraph 90 of your second affidavit, you say Janine did not tell me, but that you anticipated that it was because staff were not feeling safe in Yuendamu,
That's correct.
and would have been concerned about the prospect of being required to travel into the community at night.
That's correct.
When you say the community, you're talking about Yuendamu,
That's correct.
so back into Yuendamu.
That's correct.
All right. Do you have any questions about the staff feeling unsafe just walking around the streets?
No, that was not part of what we were managing on the day.
No, indeed. What you were managing was the fact that staff felt unsafe in their houses due to break-ins.
That's correct.
You also anticipated, perhaps I'll put it this way, there'd been no assaults on staff or anything like that.
Not to my knowledge.
There'd been no reports of unrest or fighting in the community.
Not to my knowledge.
What reason would they have to fear merely travelling into Yuendamu?
It's difficult to travel into any community after hours at night for emergency situations.
Was your concern about travel or safety once they reached Yuendamu?
It was for both. Yep.
And that was despite the fact that at paragraph 102 of your affidavit, you said that it was standard practice in these circumstances for nurses to be escorted by police.
That's been misconstrued. If we do a pre-risk assessment when prior to going on any call-outs after hours, if according to the triage that the person, the nurse is taking over the phone, if they are entering into community, not into the health centre to review a patient, but actually into community to do the assessment and emergency first assessment, primary assessment in the community, or going to a, dependent on what's been triaged, if it's a possible suicide or a possible death in community, then sometimes if there's unrest or anyone triages with a lot of noise, then we do, part of our assessment is that we contact police to ask them if they are able to assist us at the scene. So it's not an escort to the health centre, it's actually our process and our protocols to have that if we're attending a situation that we have triaged as unsafe, possibly unsafe for us, within the community itself.
So if they were concerned, let's say they travel from Yuendamu to Yuendamu Health Centre, and they need to go into the community to treat someone in their home,
That's correct.
it would be open to them to ask for a police escort.
That's correct.
Did you have any reason to think that the health staff would be at risk? I'm not talking about travelling, but be at risk from the community itself merely by travelling from Yuendamu to
No.
the Yuendamu Health Clinic?
No.
Okay. Questions now about your conversations with the Yuendamu nurses themselves. At 12:48, you have a conversation with Lorraine Walcott,
That's correct.
and Ms. Walcott expressed to you that she was concerned about the proposal that Yuendamu covered Yuendamu.
That's correct.
There are a couple of different dimensions to her concern, is that right?
That's correct.
One was the fact that the level of fatigue in that health clinic was also quite high
That's correct.
because they'd been up all night, or at least they'd been up a bit.
They'd been awake overnight. That's correct.
You then had a conversation with Heather Zanker, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And that conversation is set out at paragraph 55 of your first affidavit, I think.
Sorry, of the first or the second?
First, I'm sorry. So,
Yep,
following your conversation with Lorraine, in which she expressed her concerns, you were then advised by Janine Bridge that Heather Zanker also wanted to discuss arrangements because she had concerns of her own.
that's correct.
So, in fact, Heather was reaching out to you to express concerns.
That's correct.
One of those concerns was fatigue.
That's correct.
One of those concerns was safety.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you've given quite a bit of evidence about the need to listen to staff, haven't you?
That's correct.
Your evidence was that they tend to underreport safety concerns,
That's
to be
correct.
stoic.
That's correct.
These nurses were telling you, don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
That's a yes?
That's your interpretation, yes.
Well, they were telling you that they were concerned about this
They are concerned.
and that
yes.
they were reluctant to do this.
That's correct.
Didn't that give you pause for thought?
Obviously.
Do you think it was appropriate? Well, perhaps I can return to the evidence that you gave about your reluctance to send the Yuendamu nurses to Yuelamu because they might have been traumatised. Do you think that the opposite might have been true? That these
I accept that.
incredibly fatigued nurses who were expressing their reluctance might not have wanted to go to Yuendamu
I accept that.
and might have felt pressured to do so in the circumstances.
I accept that.
Did you think to advise Fiona or David of the level of fatigue in Yuelamu?
Not at that time.
Okay. You're aware that David Reeves' assessment of the level of risk depended on the ability of the Yuelamu clinic to service Yuendamu,
That's correct.
but he wasn't informed about the level of fatigue.
That's not at that stage, no.
No. Was he ever informed about the reluctance of Heather Zanker and Lorraine
Yes.
Walcott to travel? At what point in time?
If I can refer to my timeline. So at so I notified Fiona Cameron at 2 p.m. of the concerns raised with me from Lorraine and Heather.
That's the text in blue, is that right?
So yes, that's correct.
That says, I updated them on the above documented telephone calls.
That's correct.
Okay. But beyond that, it's not said what you actually told them.
No.
Okay. I want to just quickly return to the conversation you had with Lorraine Walcott at 12:48. Now, at 12:48, page 33 of the second affidavit, you have the relevant entry that records your conversation with her. You'd agree?
That's correct.
Now, the second half of that entry says that you gave reassurance to Lorraine Walcott that any call-outs to Yuendamu community would be for emergencies only. And then there are 2 bullet points.
That's correct.
Now, the first bullet point says, I requested that staff speak with elders and traditional owners, police, teachers, Yuendamu and old persons program.
That's correct.
Were you informing her of what you'd requested of the staff in Yuendamu?
That's correct.
And that's in blue writing, correct?
That's correct.
So it's something that you added 3 years after the fact.
That's correct.
And can I ask you to turn back a page to the 1140 entry, and the second last bullet point, the second sentence reads, in particular, I requested that staff speak with elders and traditional owners, police, teachers, Yuendamu, old persons program.
That's correct.
So there is a word perfect reflection of what you told your staff at 11:40 and what you told Lorraine Walcott that you'd told your staff. You'd agree?
Your Honour,
I accept that.
Plainly, Your Honour, the timeline might be word perfect. I don't think Miss Gill is intending to say the actual conversation was word perfect.
That's what I'm coming to, Your Honour. Sure. Would you agree that it looks like you've copied from one into the other?
I accept that.
Would you agree that you might have made assumptions about what you told one or what you told the other?
I have to accept that.
I just want to ask you finally about comment that you made that I think this is at some time between 11:40 and 2 p.m, correct me if I'm wrong. You say this reduced service, and I'm assuming the reduced service to Yuendamu, was discussed with community members within Yuendamu as well as with the police. You see that?
Sorry, can you refer me to where you are?
It's the first affidavit at paragraph 50.
Paragraph
50. First sentence
50 I've got.
of the first affidavit.
Sorry, wrong one.
No, that's my fault.
I accept that.
Now, did you make any attempt to follow up with the staff on the ground in Yuendamu to work out who they'd spoken to?
No,
You in fact knew a number of the elders in the community.
that's correct.
For example, you say, I think in your first affidavit, that due to your long-standing relationship with the central desert area, you knew Eddie Robertson quite well
That's correct.
and held him in very high regard.
That's correct.
Given your long-standing relationship with Eddie Robertson, did it occur to you to try and get him on the phone?
No, it did not.
Are you aware that on the 11th of November there was a meeting between David Reeve and a number of elders in the community of
I am aware of that.
and that with the exception of Kumanjayi Nelson, who's now passed, the elders were very angry that they hadn't been notified about the decision to leave.
I am aware of that.
Do you think that that's an indication that the request you made of your staff that they notify elders in the community failed?
Yeah, I accept that.
The last thing I want to ask you about, and I promise it's the last thing, is the call that you had with Superintendent Jody Nobbs at 2:28 p.m.
Yes,
You can recall the call.
I can recall that call.
Now, he advised you at that time that additional police resources were being sent to Yuendamu.
That's correct.
Can you tell the Rana what, if anything, you remember he said about those police resources?
I believe that he told me that he was sending in a tactical response team and the dogs.
And did he tell you what the purpose of sending the tactical team was?
Was to apprehend a person of interest.
Was there any connection in his mind or yours between that person of interest and the property offending that had been occurring?
No,
Okay. Did he tell you anything about why that person was a person of interest?
no,
Did he use that person's name?
no.
Did he tell you that there were other things that the police were going to do in the community at that time?
No.
Okay. Was there any reassessment of the level of risk that faced your staff in the community on the basis of that information that additional police were going in?
The risk assessment that we made was based on the attempted break-ins to our accommodation, whilst our staff were present in that accommodation. Police were going in. My understanding from Superintendent Nobbs was that police were attending extra police were attending Yuendamu to apprehend a person of interest. I did not inquire, and I did not know that if that person was apprehended, then if that number of police were then going to withdraw back into Alice Springs. Police were going in on to obviously provide a task and a role that they were entering community for. They weren't going in to provide security to our staff.
That assessment that you made, that they weren't going in to provide security, is that based on something Nobs actually told you, or something that you assumed?
Police aren't security.
You're aware of the concept of deterrence?
I'm aware of the concept of deterrence.
Then or now, have you heard that the police were going in to provide high visibility patrols in the community?
I have since heard that during this process.
And the purpose of that, if that's what they were to do, was to deter property offending by engaging in high visibility patrols.
Mm-hmm.
They might not be security guards, but performing much the same function as a security guard, you'd agree?
I agree.
Okay.
That information, though, can I just note that that's the information I've received now as part of this proceedings. It wasn't the information that I was privy to on the day that we made these assessments.
Not suggesting to you that it was something that you knew. Would that have been relevant to your assessment of risk had you known?
If we were aware of that, yes.
And this was at around about 2:28 p.m. in the afternoon, correct?
That's correct.
And it was at around about 2 p.m. that the nurses started rolling out of Yundamu, correct?
I was not aware of when they started to leave community because they liaised with Janine Bridge, who was monitoring their travel.
I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Those are my questions.
Yes. Madam, you will have a morning tea adjournment, so I'll take that now.
Yep.
I expect there will be some questions for you.
I'm sure there will be, Your Honour.